When Satoru Gojo was born, the balance of the world shifted. He was so powerful that curses in Japan started to grow in power over the span of years in order to counteract the strongest sorcerer of today. On the other hand, Minato Namikaze, the most talented shinobi of his time, was strong enough to shift the power balance between entire nations. When the village hidden in the leaves was at its weakest point in history during the Third Great Shinobi War, Minato went in as backup by himself and managed to grasp victory in the jaws of defeat, single-handedly turning the tides of the war. But what if these two seemingly unstoppable fighters were to clash in a head-to-head battle? Would the Honored One continue to maintain his reputation as the strongest sorcerer of today, or would he fall to the sheer lethality of the Yellow Flash? That's the question I'll be answering in this video, by going over their power, speed, and abilities to determine who would win in a fight. One thing to note before getting into the battle is that I will be assuming that chakra works the same way as cursed energy, just so we don't have to talk about shenanigans like if Minato can perceive Gojo's attacks in the first place, or if Gojo's domain would even be able to detect Minato since he doesn't have cursed energy. Starting with power, Minato comes out super strong right out the gate because his Rasengan could overpower a Biju Bomb from the Nine Tails. Obviously, this tailed Beast Bomb was nowhere near full power since Kushina's chains were suppressing the QB, and we know the attack wasn't fully formed yet due to the negative and positive chakra orbs remaining visible, but it is still possible to scale the Biju Bomb using its size. This is because a much smaller partially formed Biju Bomb made by Six Tails Naruto detonated in the middle of his fight against Pain, and using the Forest of Death shown next to the explosion as a reference, it can be calculated to have a diameter of over 20,000 meters. This places the Biju Bomb at country levels of power, and Minato would just blatantly scale above it since he overpowered a much larger one from the Nine Tails itself. But given that outside of this situation, Minato's main way of fighting the QB is through clever strategies with the Flying Raijin and Sealing Jutsu rather than directly overpowering it, I don't think it's fair to directly scale him over the Nine Tails' higher end feats. So even if you subscribe to the full Nine Tails having multi-continental Biju Bombs, or straight up being planetary due to databook statements made about him being capable of destroying the world, Minato's attack potency would cap out at country level regardless. Moving on to Gojo, as the strongest sorcerer of today, he essentially scales above every feat in the Jujutsu Kaisen verse. On paper, this should include Dagon's domain expansion, which creates an entire island, making Gojo himself island level at the very least, but a potential issue with this is that the creation of a domain just scales far beyond the user's normal output. After Jogo Cast's domain expansion, we're told that it's capable of completely nullifying Gojo's infinity, specifically because it's more potent, which means that characters far weaker than Gojo can surpass his casual use of the Limitless by using domain expansion due to how much stronger domains are in general. So even though Gojo is clearly the strongest sorcerer, it is pretty shaky to argue that his casual attacks completely surpass the domain expansions of even characters much weaker than him. That being said, I think it's perfectly fine to say that Gojo's stronger attacks, like blue, red, and especially purple, likely scale over Dagon's domain and are island level. This is because Sukuna's domain should be unfathomably stronger than Dagon's, yet Gojo is still able to use red inside it, showing that Malevolent Shrine is incapable of negating Gojo's higher end applications of the Limitless. It's not like this is a one-off instance either, since Gojo's red could also damage Sukuna through his domain amplification. with it being stated that despite his domain being capable of negating infinity, the output of red and blue is too high for Sukuna to fully negate. This is relevant because if you consider Jogo's statement from earlier, which says that domains can negate curse techniques if they're more powerful, then the fact that Gojo's able to fire off red and blue, regardless of Sukuna's domain, should scale his attacks to Malevolent Shrine's output, making them vastly superior to Dagon's Island. So, Gojo's stronger techniques pretty concretely scale to island level. But in my opinion, this is where his attack potency should probably cap out, since all the other arguments for Gojo being much stronger make some pretty bad assumptions. If you've seen enough videos talking about where Jujutsu Kaisen scales, then you've probably heard that Jogo's Maximum Meteor is stated to be capable of turning an entire town to ash in the official character guide, which would be a large country level feat. But I'm sure to most of you that the idea of turning a single town to ash being a large country level feat sounds ridiculous. And that's because it simply isn't true. The only calculation I've seen that places Maximum Meteor hypothetically burning a town to ash at large country level assumes that the entire town is brought to nearly 3,000 degrees Celsius, which is the boiling point of iron. This is a crazy thing to do because the vast majority of the average town simply isn't made of iron. Sure, there is definitely some iron that would be present, but assuming that the entire town has to be brought to iron's boiling point in order to be burnt to cinders is ridiculous, and the only reason why it can possibly be placed at large country level. Because of this, scaling Gojo anywhere near that high using Maximum Meteor doesn't make any sense, and trying to scale him to planetary based on Yuki's black hole is just as bad. To be clear, I'm not denying that the black hole itself is planet level, since Kenjaku explicitly states that the attack would have blown up the world if not for Yuki's own will and Tengen's barriers suppressing it. What I am saying is that there's no way to argue Gojo could actually scale to this attack, because despite him being the strongest sorcerer, Yuki's black hole is a one-time sacrificial technique, meaning Gojo can still be the more powerful combatant in general without having the raw power to surpass this last-ditch effort that guarantees her death. This means that there isn't really any way to get Gojo's attack potency over island level, which is massively weaker than the country level power of Minato's Rasengan. But I will say that this gap isn't nearly as big a deal as it normally would be in most versus battles. Of course, it does mean that in the specific scenario where Gojo and Minato clash directly with their strongest attacks, Minato would overpower him, but what's more important than that is if Gojo is able to land a clean hit on Minato, he should still be able to do a ton of damage because Minato's durability doesn't scale nearly as high as his Rasengan. In general, the Rasengan tends to be much more powerful than the user that creates it, since Kid Naruto could use it to one-shot Kabuto, who is a Kakashi level opponent, despite the fact that Naruto was nowhere near as strong as Kakashi at this point in the series. And we know that Minato is no exception to this rule, because while fully on guard, he gets a wooden splinter from a safety house getting blown up by a few paper bombs, which would make absolutely no sense if he had country level durability. So even though Gojo probably can't overpower Minato's Rasengan, if he manages to land a hit on Minato himself, it should be capable of doing massive damage. Although landing a hit on Minato is a lot easier said than done, which brings us to the speed section of the video. As the title Yellow Flash implies, Minato is one of the fastest shinobi to ever live, with the second databook noting that his kunai attacks on the battlefield were light speed, While you could normally argue that this is just hyperbole, shinobi around Jonin Minato's level being light speed is just super consistent, since the Raikage's lariat is also stated to have light-like speed in Data Book 4, aligning with his speed being compared to Jonin Minato's in the same guide. And this is further supported by the fact that the Raikage could completely evade Amaterasu, which is an attack that's placed on the same pedestal as Kirin for typically being completely undodgeable. This is particularly relevant because Kirin is stated to be the speed of light in both the 3rd data book and the 2nd fan book, meaning the Amaterasu should be comparable to the speed of light as well. Yet the Raikage was capable of completely evading it. This should place a more inexperienced Jonin Minato at a bare minimum of light speed, and considering that he would later go on to be praised by all as having the greatest godlike speed, with even the Raikage himself stating that he's only been the fastest shinobi since the 4th Hokage died, Minato should be a good deal faster than light when he's alive and in his prime. On the other hand, Gojo's speed scaling is a lot more contentious because it's a lot harder to come to a concrete consensus when it comes to how fast Jujutsu Kaisen's characters are. There is the infamous Mach 3 Nalia statement, which keeps every power scaler awake at night, but this limit shouldn't apply to Gojo and Sukuna because of how far above the rest of the cast they are, with even Naobito Zenin, a sorcerer who was reputed for being the fastest, having a specific asterisk next to his title, for the exception that is Satoru Gojo. In my opinion, Gojo should be the speed of lightning at the very least, due to Hikari's feat of tracking Kashimo's lightning bolt. It's undeniable that he visually registered the lightning bolt coming at him at the very least. So even though the heavy hitters may not be lightning timers themselves in terms of physical speed, their general reaction time is still fast enough to legitimately track lightning bolts. This is massive for Gojo's speed because we see later on that a heavily weakened Sukuna can perception blitz Maki when he gets somewhat serious, completely disappearing from her line of sight, despite the fact that she has particularly good senses and should have lightning level perception just like Hikari. Considering that this Sukuna has cursed energy reserves and output far below the one that fought Gojo, the fact that Gojo was capable of keeping up with the King of Curses and even had the advantage in close combat should make him a lightning timer. The only possible way Gojo could be significantly faster than this is if you argue that Sukuna was able to dodge Kashimo's electromagnetic wave attack, since EM waves practically travel at light speed even outside of a vacuum, which means that Sukuna would have to be near the speed of light to evade it. But this argument is very shaky since Sukuna is just shown to have seen the attack charging up in the previous panel. This means that Sukuna could have moved out of the way while the attack was still charging up, which doesn't require him to be anywhere near light speed and makes this argument a lot harder to sell. If you do think that Sukuna actually dodged a light speed attack though, then both him and Gojo should be much faster than light at full power, because in the fight against Kashimo, Sukuna had reserves at an all-time low, a single arm, and hadn't even entered his true form yet. Personally, I think that lightning speed Gojo is a lot more consistent than him being faster than light, but I will go over both interpretations when analyzing the fight for the sake of making the video a bit more interesting. And speaking of analyzing the fight, it's time to go over Minato and Gojo's win conditions, or in other words, the ways in which they could realistically beat each other. Starting with the ways Minato could win, one of the biggest questions is whether or not the Flying Raijin can bypass infinity, Gojo's technique that allows him to infinitely slow down all attacks that approach him. And the answer to that question is probably not. at least in the way that Minato typically uses the jutsu. This might seem weird since the Flying Raijin is a jutsu that transcends space and time, which should make it easy for Minato to bypass infinity on paper, but the issue is that from what's shown in most of Minato's fights, he still has to physically move to hit the opponent even after teleporting. If Minato could teleport with his attack already on Gojo, it would be a completely different story. But considering that even when fighting Ten Tails Madara, who had a marked kunai right at his feet, which is a scenario where Minato shouldn't hold back anything in his arsenal, he still only teleports in front of Madara before trying to hit him normally, which obviously didn't go well. This leads me to believe that Minato probably can't teleport directly on someone with an attack, which may sound contradictory considering that he supposedly did it to Obito more than once, but the difference between this scenario and all the other ones is that Minato has a Flying Raijin marking placed directly on Obito's body. So I think the best interpretation of all these scenes is that unless Minato has a marking directly on his opponent, it's not possible for him to teleport while attacking them, which is a massive problem because Gojo's Infinity would prevent Minato from placing a marking on him in the first place. The only circumstance where Minato could actually land an FTG marking on Gojo would be during the Curse Technique burnout that happens after a domain expansion, since there should be a small time frame right after the domain, but before Gojo uses RCT to restore his technique where Infinity would be down. And if Minato lands a marking during this time period, the fight is pretty much over. I already went over why Minato's Rasengan should scale a good deal above Gojo's durability, meaning if he's hit in the head, which would halt regeneration with reverse curse technique as long as the brain is damaged, it's almost assuredly a win for Minato. However, this particular win condition for Minato does assume that Gojo's domain expansion will completely fail to take Minato out and leave him with no curse technique, which I'll talk about in depth later in the video when discussing the ways Gojo can win, but for now just know that this may not be entirely correct. That being said, a jutsu Minato has that would be particularly effective against Gojo, even with Infinity up, is the Flying Raijin Guiding Thunder. This jutsu opens a rift in space-time, which Minato uses to redirect attacks. And this could be a way for Minato to beat Gojo, because he should be capable of redirecting Gojo's own purple back at him. We see in Gojo's fight against Sukuna that Hollow Purple is capable of going through Infinity to damage him. And while it didn't completely take Gojo out, which he attributes to the fact that it's made of his own cursed energy, it is worth noting that the purple didn't hit him head on. Right before red and blue collide, we get a perspective shot that shows they were far above Gojo and Sukuna, which means that they were only caught in the greater explosion of the technique rather than getting hit directly. So if Minato redirects purple to actually hit Gojo, it's possible that Gojo could be completely destroyed by his own technique, considering that even getting caught in the explosion of one did a decent amount of damage. Another possible use of Guiding Thunder that would be able to bypass Infinity and defeat Gojo is closing the portal around him Doctor Strange style to cut him in half, since it is a crack in space-time itself, but this is just completely out of character for Minato to actually do. So this use of Guiding Thunder shouldn't be considered a realistic win condition against Gojo. I just thought it was interesting enough to mention, since it is at least hypothetically possible if you were to take Minato out of character. One last thing to note when talking about Minato's methods of defeating Gojo is the possibility of Minato sealing him. To be blunt, I think this win condition is pretty bad, since in Naruto, sealing jutsu tend to require physical contact, which is obviously made impossible by Infinity. We see that whenever Minato reinforces seals, he makes physical contact with them. And when Minato uses the 8 trigram seal on the Nine Tails, he's also touching its claw, which makes it very difficult to argue that Minato's regular sealing jutsu would work on Gojo without touching him. The only sealing jutsu in Minato's arsenal that's an exception to this rule is the Reaper Death Seal, but using that requires Minato to sacrifice his own life, meaning this strategy would result in a draw at best, and is probably something Minato wouldn't go for unless he legitimately thinks he has no other way to win, which I couldn't see happening in this fight. As opposed to Minato, Gojo's win conditions are a lot more simple, and the first one is literally just to land a clean hit. As I mentioned earlier, since Minato is a speedster, his physical toughness isn't anything to write home about, which means that if Gojo can connect with a clean strike, it's probably a wrap, since Minato has no significant regeneration and would take a massive amount of damage from pretty much everything in Gojo's arsenal. This is why Gojo's speed is so important, because if he's only vaguely above the speed of lightning, which is less than 1% of the speed of light, then there's no way in hell he could possibly hit Minato, even without taking the flying Raijin into consideration. But if Gojo is faster than light, then this is an extremely simple way for him to win, especially since his attacks have a massive area of effect, which increases his chances of tagging Minato. Don't get me wrong, even if Gojo was faster than light, it would still be difficult to tag Minato due to his ability to evade using flying Raijin, but it is definitely a possibility, and in my opinion a lot more straightforward than the win conditions I went over for Minato. As for the more grounded interpretation of Gojo, that's the speed of lightning, he only really has one way to take Minato down in the form of his domain expansion, Unlimited Void. Even 1/100th of a second in Gojo's domain would likely stun Minato long enough for Gojo to take him down. But the problem is that if Minato throws out kunai across the battlefield at the beginning of the fight, which he does do in character, then he can just teleport outside of the domain's range using flying Raijin before it takes effect. And if Minato sees Gojo's scary looking domain start to surround him, there's no shot that he wouldn't immediately try to teleport as far away as possible, making it pretty unlikely that he'd be caught in Unlimited Void. But there is still one factor that gives Gojo's domain a possible shot at taking Minato out, which is shadow clones. Minato sometimes uses shadow clones in character, and the reason why this drastically increases Unlimited Void's chance of working is that the experience between Minato and his clones are linked, which means that if Gojo can catch a single clone in his domain, the original Minato will get the backlash. We know this is the case because during Naruto's Rasen Shuriken training, where he was using shadow clones to get as much experience as possible, he actually fell unconscious due to the mental fatigue of the clones. Which means that if one of Minato's shadow clones gets caught in Unlimited Void, he'd be completely finished. What makes this even worse is that Naruto characters often send clones in as fodder in order to gain information on their opponents. Meaning Minato might even leave a clone in Gojo's domain on purpose to get intel, only for the transfer of information to completely backfire and lose him the fight. It's not like Gojo knows about the information of clones transferring back to the original though, so him winning this way can only really be done through sheer luck, which makes it pretty unlikely to happen since it is very possible that Minato just doesn't have a shadow clone out when Gojo uses his domain and gets outside the barrier with the flying Raijin. There's also the added risk that if Gojo's domain fails, he would temporarily lose his curse technique, and I already went over why that would result in a complete Minato victory. To wrap things up, If you think Gojo is only lightning speed or slower, Minato should probably win the fight 9 times out of 10. Even though his win conditions are a bit more complicated, Gojo simply wouldn't be able to land a hit, and Unlimited Void, his only other method of winning, would only work in the very niche scenario where Minato already has Shadow Clones out, and if he doesn't, then the temporary drop of Gojo's Infinity that comes afterwards practically guarantees Minato the victory. On the other hand, if you think that Gojo is faster than light, just like Minato, then Gojo should be able to win 7 times out of 10, since he's reached a speed where hitting Minato is a legitimate possibility and would probably be capable of winning before Minato can think to try some of the admittedly obscure win conditions that I brought up earlier. Thanks for watching. I'm definitely going to be making more JJK content in the foreseeable future, so make sure to subscribe if you want to check that out. Later!